information is provided on an as is basis.
Welcome, welcome. In a crime where there's, how can I say this? It's been a while. In a world where there's crime, corruption, murder, rape, theft, and all forms of atrocity that plague the world in which we live in today, we're living in a state of chaos, and it takes a great or extreme chaos to restore order in which the world we live in today. Hello, everybody. This is Chaos Rain here, and this broadcast will be a series that I'm going to hopefully dedicate. Um, and this is going to be more focused on a reading of a particular book I have got in my hand, which I have not spent too much time reading, but I've knew about for months now, and I think it's good for context for a more deeper discussion in regards to race and how people are interacting sexually in race and dating market. Because as you know, I've been listening to the airways, listen to a lot of content. They talk about people's options. Obviously, no, men are gonna have more options than women, especially if you're a black man. I mean, obviously, because women by default want men, and you know, as we see this gender divide, as it's going to continue to azoo, that we should have a more clear understanding of the historical aspects of how race is dealt in this country, personally, so that way we don't get fooled by other propaganda schemes. Rather, we create propaganda or other outside means of creating it. We have more understanding of really the actual history and where it's actually going. And is it really factual that when the projection of America in 2055 or 54 or 53 of what the complexion of America is going to look like, that's solely determined by the outcomes of what the next generation is doing now, and we are seeing it firsthand. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe as well. I would appreciate it. Um, I've covered the introduction last time, and now, as you know, you're hearing this broadcast today. I'm now gonna go into the chapter ahead now, and particularly this book. And it looks like I found something here. Hmm, hold on. Oh, I found the marker where I last stopped reading. I stopped read, but nonetheless, actually, should I finish read it? Let me see. Eh, maybe I should. Yeah, I'll do that instead. And I'll give a quick snippet depending how lengthy this is. I'll just go into the chapter ahead. So let me just make sure I count how many pages. Oh, actually, ooh, this thing got, yeah. So I'm definitely not gonna probably cover the first chapter. Now I think about it, because now I found my bookmark where I was at. So nonetheless, move forward, and which I'm going to do right now. To carry on to the introduction part. So listen carefully, like always. And like I said, you're going to leave your comments during or after the broadcast. Um, let's continue on. And as you know, the book that I'm covering is called "The Dating Divide: By Race and Desires in the Era of Online Romance" by Chelsea Vaughn and Currington and Jennifer H. Lundquist and Ken Hu Lin. Two European women and one Asian woman. Imagine that. Let's continue on. What is the current state of interracial intimacy unions? The U.S. Americans have altered their public stance dramatically on interracial marriage since the mid 20th century. In 1958, the first time Gallup ran an option poll that asked U.S. Americans whether they approve of marriage between whites and non whites, 96% of response voiced disapprove. By 2013, the portion of was only 13%, and there's a figure. Strictly, the black Americans have always been far more supportive of interracial marriage than whites. Obviously, because black is evil, white is purity, it is God. So obviously that makes sense. Whites on the gap, to be sure, has narrowed significant, but the overall difference is still substantial. In the late 1960s, about half as many black Americans as, and there's figures. I'm not going to go through the figures. But anyway, whites disapprove of interracial marriage at 44% compared to 83%. Today, although both populations have become far more open, whites are still nearly four times more likely than blacks to voice disapproval for interracial marriage at 15% compared to 4%. No other social options in the history of U.S. Gallup survey has reversed so completely over time. In just 5 decades, the vast majority of U.S. Americans went from disapproving the approving of the interracial marriage. Some of the shift reflects generationally change. The disapproval trends shown in this figure will be all but non-existent if we limit surveys to gather only the options of young adults, given that young generations tend to voice more progression views towards race. The only other capable shift in public opinion relates to gay rights, but the lag far behind a level that might be called near universal support. Another parameter for testing attitude about interracial marriage is the extent of which group participates in the practice. The intimate act of marriage between two people from different groups provide an indicating social distance, and social science having argues that an increased prevalence of marriage between racial and ethnical groups over time suggests fading prejudice, more interracial itself during further racial integrations. Interpret channels of resource and wealth acquisitions that have been historically concentrated among white families. Despite the sea change in public opinions, actual intermarriage rates are low. Only 6.3% of current U.S. marriage are interracial. If we include Latinos as a distinct group in these measures, intermarriage rates would still tally up to only 17% in current unions figures compared to actual intermarriage to the rates we would expect if marriage happened at random across the population. Compared the observed bars to the random bars, we see that across every racial and white, or actually racial and ethnic groups, the actual intermarriage rate are 3 to 5 times lower than that would could be. The number points to a large and ongoing racial divide in marriage partners. A number of studies have also indicated that cohabitating and dating partnerships are more likely than marriage to be interracial. Indeed, while intermarriage continues to be a meaningful indicator of the race relations change in U.S. society, have made marriage less central than its one, and was particularly for young adults in their early and mid 20s. The wider acceptance of non-marital partnership and cohabitation has delayed and even begun to replace marital unions. However, evidence suggests that unions are still significantly separate by racial boundaries because of the way race interacts with intimacy in virtually all contexts. Cohabitation couples, non-material partners, and marriage couples are all subject to be scrutiny that animates our interest in racial preference and racial hierarchies. Why does our racial happy talk seem to stop at the bedroom doors? I'll tell you why. Because sex is on the table. my good author ladies, two Caucasian women and one Asian lady. That's why. Once the sex is done, then interaction happens, and usually interaction is where it all stops. Once we try to really interact and know each other, for lack of better words. Anyway, prejudice or lack of exposure to others. Some people argue that the reason why U.S. interracial unions are rare is not racial bias, but a lack of social exposure across racial groups. There is no question that residential segregation continues to be a defining feature of U.S. society despite legislation from the Civil Rights era onward, in addition to leading to a promiscuous concentration of disadvantaged segregation. Several limit cross racial exposures in everyday life. Beyond the neighborhood, segregation partners spill out across school districts, churches, and employment. Setting as a result, the U.S. population is diverse, but most people are in only infrequent enacting with people from other racial backgrounds. The contact that exists is rarely meaningful. This is particularly true of black and white, both of whom are more segregated from each other than they are from any other group. Racial segregation and the consequent lack of exposure is more profound than simple spatial independence. Lack of familiarity can lead to people to develop problematic perception of those who are socially distinct, in this case, people from racial groups other than their own. Unfamiliarity may exaggerate any difference from religious traditions to taste in music, for example, such that this seems like a clear indication of romantic incompatibility, worsen separation, reinforce stereotypes, and fuel racist antagonism. As a result, racial bias and racial segregation are not independent reasons behind the roughly and interracial unions. They are mutual reinforcing cause of ongoing separation. In the United States, explicit racial prejudice among whites has certainly declined. However, whites grow commit to racial equality does not mean they don't still harbor implications bias that favor whites and over other groups. In the long run, U.S. Americans may have become more tolerant of difference in theory, but tolerance in rhetoric of tolerance may have little bearing on choosing intimacy partners. Race also operates intersectionality or in ways structured by combination of status like race and gender, and sexuality, which that intersectional is perhaps nowhere as clear as within interracial marriage. Black men are twice as likely as black women to marry outside of their racial group, but it is the reverse among Asian women, who are more than twice as likely as Asian men to marry non-Asians. And we're gonna put a highlight over here. Yeah, yeah, that's important. These trends contradict what some theorists would predict, given that black women and Asian men are average have higher levels of education. Thus, the gender difference are unlikely to be explained by individual characteristics, more likely as argued by gender racial formations. Theory. They reflect pathologists' notions of desirability and ideals of masculinity and femininity. Throughout U.S. history, the white racial frame has cast whiteness as the virtues baseline and all other race as inferior deviations. Combined with gender norms and white frames have produced an intersectionality hierarchy of desirability. The most typical and those are images that associate passive femininity with Asians and hypermasculinity with blacks. Play out intersectionality. This leads to emasculate negative images of Asian men and complaints sexually alluring image of Asian women. The same frame produced images of black men as dangerous, virtue, and black women as unfeminine and overly dominant. Highlight that there. Keep that in mind. Despite the apparent contrast and how these associates play out the different groups, make no mistake, they are all forms of dehumanization. Keep that in mind. The Masonic or controlling image of perpetual harmful stereotypes may be driving some of the outmarriage trends seen in this figure. They are certainly firmly embedded in the legacy of a United States racial history and contributes to the intersectional asymmetric of inclusion. These harmful stereotypes further serve to justify racial inequality because they obscure the structural arrangements that led the unequal concentration of power that is stereotype emphasize individual and group flaws as the ultimate explanation for differential opportunities and outcomes. The result of racial structure are in turn utilized to justify unequal or unequal treatment to otherwise reinforce white advantage. And there's pictures. Interesting. As Patrice Hill Collins assert all of these control images concerning first the foremost sexuality, but it is clear that the narrative of second deviant traits solidify and justify many other racial distinctions. Joanne Nagel argues that such sexualization of outgrowth is a unequivocal universal feature of power in the role of interethnic relations that is alleging the sexual depravity of others versus the moral innocence of us. It is centrally constructed of white racial hegemony written historically in colonialism and consequence for examples of other including graphic depictions of the sexual depravity of subturned groups encountered during the civilizing process. In the American early colonists detailed the problematic and low sexual practice observed among indigenous people, which later served justified warfare and extermination policies. African sexuality was similar depicted in European and later U.S. American likewise helped legitimize enslavement. Means legitimize enslavement. While the white gaze remains dominant today, it is also true that what they call marginalizing groups, even if they internalize some of the oppressive culture, which black people do, ideologize ideologize often develops alternate hierarchies of desirability that resist white beauty standards. This resistance to white or close to white beauty standards was frequently mentioned by the minority daters and interviews, and it's too critical to understand how race influenced dating preference. Moreover, although gender racial hierarchies produce animus within and across racial groups, we find that the behavioral difference between men and women is much smaller than popular stereotypes, such as, for example, despite the fact that black men and Asian women outnumber more often than their same race counterparts, and the vast majority of blacks and Asian Americans still seek union within their own racial group. Yeah, depending on the sex, but that's another story. This book examines how all racial groups make sense of these dynamics by integrational the social construct of racial preference in dating. We exclude or elucidate how dating decisions and ideologies are nested within racial power and the long legacy of historical administrative laws. As the United States diversifies, some scholars have called on their peers to more the beyond the black-white binary focus on racial oppression, prejudice, and race relationships. Juan Pereira influentially argues that race scholars often pragmatically ignore racial groups other than white and black, and that when they do acknowledge these groups, it is only barely only because they feel requires designate where a group of or given groups fall in the middle ground of the black white axis. In this book, we push past the boundaries to analyze intimate relations among blacks, Asians, Latinos, whites, and multiracial daters. Still, we also subscribe theoretically to the Afro-Premistist perspective that, as Jared Sexton put in highlights as specifically of anti-blackness under white supremacy. So his books go into a lot of areas. Patriarchally, in the United States, the black-white monolith remains a principal racial dialect that undergrinds white supremacy. To understand where racial partners' preference come from, we must first delve into the history of U.S. racial divide in intimacy life. This is an easy task in a country that has yet to fully come to terms with its own history of racial violence and exclusion. Specifically, we must begin with the peculiar relics of weapons of anti-blackness that marks our history of intimate racial boundaries. Anti-miscegenation laws. Anti-miscegenation laws in North America dates back to well before the founding of the Republic. Some were enacted as early as the 17th century. As it once or as its core, miscegenation policies were explicit intended in prohibiting black-white unions, but they were also used abated more what they call haphazardly to police the marriage of whites with non-black racial outgroups in the mid 20th century. The majority of the population of severe or several southern states were black. When slavery was abolished, white southerners feared a demographic white genocide threatened a moral panic that might rather be forgotten by the white majority today but thrive amongst the white nationalists alt-right. The alt-right. Anti-miscegenation laws, which proliferate such that they became keys to Jim Crow after the Civil War and Reconstruction, became weapons in a war to maintain the social and political privilege of whites. They all but ensured a post slavery racial caste system between 1874 and 1913. The number of states passing anti miscegenation laws nearly doubled. Such laws perpetuate and reinvent anti blackness in response to a brief post Civil War raise in black political, economic, and social power, especially in the U.S. South. Indeed, Jim Crow policies were so effective in preventing black white racial integrations that the archives of the third relic of German and apartheid regime in South America would draw inspiration from the United States in constructing their own assimilation laws and policies. In 1967, the Supreme Court decision of Loving versus Virginia determined that all states' anti-miscegenation laws and laws criminalizing interracial sex were unconstitutional. However, many of these laws remained on the books until recently. Pause. You mean until recently? So when did it really struck down in every state? Because we all know that's Virginia, but other states don't really abide by the laws for all the land for every state in regards to miscegenation laws. Hope y'all are aware of this, men and women, especially you black man and black woman. Just saying. The last two states level anti-miscegenation laws were not overturned until 1998. South Carolina and 2000, Alabama. That's roughly 26 years ago, and now roughly 24 years ago in Alabama. South Carolina, 26 years ago. Alabama, now 24. That's not a long time. That's just now roughly a generation ago. So if these are only two states, and I would conclude there probably was more, but the book only states these two states, it lets you know that not every state was down for anti-miscegenation laws, especially South Carolina. That's where my good friend Tyler Thompson is at, and anybody else that's from South Carolina, you will understand. Even when anti-miscegenation laws, policies, and the racial ideology that it perpetuates were no longer legal enforced, the ideologies of racial separation has become accepted way of life. Their legacy is now self-enforced, perpetuating the certainty of race and intimacy and family formation throughout this book. We will marshal extensive data to discuss the evolution of consequence of this history well into the present era. So it's going to be point by point of the history. And it says racial choice narrative and sexual racism. One integration and telling aspect of the online dating industry is that it is one of only venues left in modern day U.S. society where it remains acceptable to articulate racial preference. In education, employment, and housing and lending, racial preference have been recognized are not only legally but also morally wrong. Yet, racial categories are explicit and unapologetically part of the selection process of dating websites. Many of the most popular dating sites ask users to specify their racial preference in their profiles and codify them with partners searching filters by race. We challenge readers to name another public venue in which it is socially acceptable or legal to ask individuals to indicate whether they prefer some race over others. In any other public context, we believe that open expression of racial preference will be condemned, boycott, and even prosecuted as unlawful discrimination. The use of racial preference on dating sites point to several complicating but crucial issues underlying the formation of race itself. We cannot talk about race in the dating context without having a conversation about racializing that is the social construct of race through which we attach meaning in the racial categories that carry economic, political, and social consequence. It is an oxymoron to describe racial preference in individuals because race is, by definition, a social construct and manufactured distinctions generated throughout the regulation of intimate life. For centuries, the state that taken keen interest in encouraging and policing marriage by racial status, the individual choice stories we tell about mate preference today are connected to the legacy of the anti-miscegenation laws and racial segregation social practice and go beyond black-white boundaries to affect the dating choices we see among all racial groups. Has been so long, no more than a generation since intermarriage laws were on the books, and so intermarriage norms remain on our minds. Attempt to resist the crucial examination of racial preference, such as narrative about chemistry and homophilia, takes the existence of racial boundaries for grants and rationalize them in a natural. They fail to recognize that the preference that similars or for similarity as well as for difference have a social basics individuals and interview talks about the openly saying, for example, I am just not into Asians. It's much the same way and might talk about their dietary and music preference. But of course, it's false. Equivalence, one of the preferences for white partners are not so innocent as preference for what they call choice and avocado, or artichokes and avocados. Those are food. There are research for this book. We asked a group of predominantly white college students their opinions of people being able to filter their search by race on dating apps and websites. A full 64% of them had no problem with it at all. Commonly, we heard the racialized sexual attraction is inevitable and uncontrollable. If you know you are only attracted to one specific race or looks, then they and that sorry is not something we can't control, said one response. Others believe that racial preference was merely idiosyncratic. Idiosyncratic. Yes, a lot of work. On par with physical preference. I prefer people with blue or green eyes. That doesn't mean I generally prejudice against dark eyed people. I have brown eyes myself. We heard many people we interviewed were clearly invested in the idea of personal choice in the mating or intimate partner is above critique, a judgment, even when the choice means a rejection of entry and racial categories. One gay white man who excludes blacks and Asians profiles from his dating site search radically as us. Does the fact that I'm also not into women makes me a sexist? Hmm, that's a big question. Certainly, some people, particularly racial and ethnic minority daters, saw state racial preference as a form of racism. Other exceptions of the existence of racial preference but on air and inevitable include or indicate that what bothers them more was the normalization inherent in such assertion. For example, a Latina woman told us she thought it was okay to have the preference, but was not okay to check a box and filter potential dating dates by race. If it is subconscious thing, is less problematic than if you verbalize it and make a conscious decision like I'm going to look at white guys. This sentiment contains uncurrent and modern colorblind racism where racializing sentiments is considered impolite, but impolite racial bias are granted tacit allowance. I don't think that's racist. If you have a preference, you should carry out your preference instead of wasting people's time. And that's the problem with online dating and in general. Just if you're going to seek out dates or go out with someone, explain it calmly, respectfully, and move on. That would be better advice. 1 second. All right. Does this mean that daters who are more attracted to some race over the others are racist? Many would disagree with such a claim, countering that partner choice is a question of individual desire, not a matter of prejudice or racial superiority. To be very clear, it is not our objective or in turn intention to judge individuals for their personal dating preference. In some cases, individual racism can play little part in why one person marries another in the same racial background. So, too, might interracial relation be formed in a context rift with other racism, overt racism. Sorry. Instead, our aim is to call into question the naive views that intimate racial preference are natural ap- applicants and inconsequential indeed, as we show throughout this book. Society forces to insist on a racial hierarchy of desire people or desire shape our intimate desires, whether or not we like to address that fact. Is sexual desire a topic for public scrutiny? People intimate lives are often askew from scrutiny, both because they are hidden and also because the private realm is considered scarce from the preview of the public. However, in the 1980s, more and more feminist scholars began to call this claim into question. Kimberly Crenshaw observed that the process of recognizing as social and systematic was formerly perceived as isolated and individual characteristics, and the identity politics of Americans or African Americans, other people of color, and gays and lesbians amongst others. Indeed, a feminist group and activists identified how the politics of power and rape and the intersection between racism and patriarchy were embedded in the formation of mainstream sexual expression. They argued that sexual desire often goes hand to hand with political power, but this perspective failed to gain mainstream political traction in both the dominant liberal feminist discourse and non feminist discourse of the day. Today, despite these scholars' efforts, sexual preference is still widely considered to be personal and therefore neutral in the relationships to power. If anything, sexual desire and preference are considered right that needs to be protected from public sanctions. As one of our interviews insists about racial preference in online dating, I think it's your choice, it's your body, it's your life. In a way, sexual preference, it seems by many as synonymous with sexual freedom. Yet the reluctance of acknowledging the political implications of sexual desire means that we also frame racial sexual preference as something outside political and social constructs. What happens to the personal and political and concept of sexual racism, first coined in 1976, and Charles Stenberg's analysis of black and white heterosexual relations is gaining new traction today as internet content ranges from pornographic to online dating, making one private sexual fantasy and desire abundantly visible. Black feminists and crucial race scholars have also long challenged the idea that sexual preference is nothing more than individual taste. Instead, they point to how the social construct of personal preference masks racism and sexism, and how the legacy of slavery and colorism continues to haunt other erotic lives. We join the critique the crucial inquiry because the rhetoric of personal choice invokes randomness, idiosyncrasies, but our research showed that it is mapped precisely into existing racial hierarchies that have been identified and condemned in other spheres. Logic such as mind mystical personal preference or natural affinity stem from false distinctions so often drawn between the private and public sphere. The same rhetoric that drew feminism of feminine eerie in response to the regulation of women's bodies. If we can't acknowledge that race is a social construct, we cannot deny that the categories of desire and also social construct and language that precede the Holland quotes opening this introduction. Rosemary Hennessy once wrote, when desire is understood as lust, where lust is equal with the basic human drive, is historically productive becomes invisible. We cannot change what we cannot see. Accordingly, to we seek to render the very real roles historical product and racialized dating preference visibility. Interracial intimacy theorists threatens white privilege and power. Intimate relations between racial groups have long been viewed as deeply subversive, potentially fueling powerful social change and disruptions in the years following the Civil War and the collapse of Reconstruction. It was the threat of white black sexual reproduction that ultimately drove Jim Crow legislations, racial amalgamation, direct threatened the caste system by expanding other groups across the white privilege and power, not least the making it possible that mixed race person might pass as white, while the decision of Loving and Virginia of 1967 to ban anti-miscegenation laws sometimes seem as less important than other 20th century civil rights cases that end school segregation and employee discrimination and impact has been crucial in the rights or in the fight against the legalization and structural racism. Sorry, legacy and structural racism. Let me see how much more pages left. The legal scholar Dorothy Roberts argues that it was, in fact, more foundational than any other case for dismantling white supremacy. School segregation, for example, was at least partially put in place to mitigate against the kind of white black contact that might lead to intimate relationships. Later, during the civil rights era, this same fear of interracial sex and procreation still fuels white anxiety. For instance, in the widely disturbing pamphlet that also was reprinted in 1956 in an article that School Race Integration, written by a Southerner in the Atlantic Monthly, identified primary schools as sites where the South must insist on maintaining racial separation, and authors suggest that northern states support the desegregation, revealed their ignorance of the risk of intimate relations such that, and is quoted and stated in this paragraph here, which I'll read, race preference is not active in the very young. Race preference, which they propagandists miscall race prejudice or hate, is one of those instincts which develop gradually as the mind develops, in which it takes it hard early enough can be prevented from developing at all. It is compelling reason, though by no means the only reason, why the South will resist which all resource minds and the body in mixing the race in the public school. The article also states Northern supports of school integration in the South is due to failure to realize the inevitable biological effects of regions of large Negro populations. And Northern didn't realize this during enthusiasm enthusiasm for mixed schools in the South would evaporate at once. The author reference to race preference is an argument that bottles or bubbles up today 60 some years later in conversations about whether sexual preference of online dating profiles reflect prejudice or natural instinct. In the United States, the state of no longer explicitly enforce the racial hierarchy of desire and reproduction. We citizens do that all ourselves, as we illustrate throughout this book. We citizens do all by ourselves. As we illustrate throughout this book, as I repeat again, the media continues to propagate messages and images that exalt men and women who tilt closest to whiteness while marginalizing non-white feminities and masculinist families and peers network shape, reproduce, and enforce racialized desires. And individual internalize the regulatory gaze of anti-miscegenation and pause and policing themselves in a perpetual corn like realm of seemingly limitless mate choice. The widespread of rhetoric in the U.S. culture that champions individual choice and consumption in all areas of life obscure the roles of history and culture and shape sexual preference despite how strongly people believe those choices in the bias of their own autonomous preference. The extensive data, interviews, and other evidence that we present demonstrate the profound influence of the past in our present day personal life throughout the new manifestation of digital sexual racism. That's a new word. In a place like the United States, where subordinate masculinity and femininity have been constructed and authenticized to white hegemonic ideals and beauty of desirability, the choice of match mates and love with someone like ourselves take an additional meaning. Indeed, beyond the policies of black and white boundaries in the 19th century, Asian marriage and reproduction were actively suppressed. Asian women were banned from the country, and Asians were constructed legally and socially and racially unmarriageable to whites and unassimilable to the United States. Latino and United States have been differently or different histories of discrimination, but they too have been targeted in anti-miscegenation laws. Interestingly, the long legacy of racial regulations and repression or repression has also prompted minority movements prompting interracial marriage and ownership. For instance, the curtailing of African American marriage and sexual freedom fed into Black love and Black is beautiful movement and constructs some racial marriage as a political obligation aligned with the Black pride. When marginalizing groups choose to date someone like themselves, we must consider how those decisions are also shaped by the power system that inform the social construct of racial hierarchy, preference, and modes of resistance. Organization of this book we read right here, called The Dating Divide. The book provides an in-depth analysis of dating behaviors in the 20th century, document racial preference among Asians, Black, Latinos, whites, and multiracial daters across sexual orientation. We have gained insight from extensive and personal equivalent research and well as date from one of the largest online dating websites in the United States. In chapter one, where hate Trump loves, the birth or legacy of anti-miscegenation laws in the United States, or anti-miscegenation in the United States, we situate current romantic dynamics within the history of U.S. marriage, race, relationships, anti-miscegenation laws, which prohibits cross-racial mixing, and in immigration policies, which limit marital choice. We trace how racial preferences were both constructed and legitimized through law before the civil rights era, and how they were recast as binging in modern rhetorics of individual choice. We illustrate how these legal imperatives aid in the solidification of racial categorizing, demonstrating the inextricable leakage between the social construct of race, gender, and personal preference. The manifestation or the manifest itself today in a new online form, digital sexual racism, which exists today. Chapter 2. From the back porch to the computer screen is that what it's called computer love, baby. The race of choice and courtship. We look at the late 19th century transformation of courtship that concludes or coincides with the reformation of post-conceptual racial identities. As courtship evolves always from family and community-centered institutions into individualistic behavior and practice, remain nesting in nationwide initiative to reinforce racial distinction. Thus, the view that whites and racial minority groups such or should not mix and marry became self-enforced as a filter into individual courtship choice. The advent of online dating represents potential for the highest degree of sexual freedom by lessening dependence on third-party introduction and increasing cross-racial contacts, but self-regulation against cross-racial contact has substantially mute this opportunity. The consumption-oriented aspects of online dating allow dating to rationalize this process as akin to the whole constellation of quotating or quantitating consumer choice. The dynamic has set the stage for a new form of digital sexual prejudice that is hidden under the guise of choice. The guise of choice. Chapter 3. New rules. Gender online engagement. focus on several important issues relating to gender construction. Despite the potential of transformation of or in an online space, traditional gender norms retrench themselves with the woman rarely intimate contact and men driving most interactive similar. Straight men are particularly compelled by the physical attributes of potential partners. Straight women, with the notable exception of their fixation of men, heightened tends to focus on education, status, and personality attributes. Lesbians and gay daters, however, describe greater freedom in the online context to what do you call experiment and play with gender norms. The rising question of whether racial hierarchy like gender norms play out differently among gays and straight daters. This chapter acts as a gateway into the epiral chapters focusing on the majority of racial groups. Take a quick pause. Breathe. All right. In chapter 4, the privilege enduring dating while white in the era of online dating, we discuss a distinct narrative of white masculinity in crisis with relations to intimacy choice. Our analysis show that all groups of women and most gay men respond to white men. In other words, white men continue to be advantaged romantically, even more so than white women. I want that to sit in a bit. I want that to sit in for y'all. We illustrate the specific operation of anti blackness among white men who tend to accept all but black women as romantic options when dating online. While white women exclude all non white men, we consider how a racial and ethnic minority groups interpret these trends and explore some black women consciousness subversion of the white frame. Can't wait to get to that chapter. A lot of you ladies not gonna like this. Hell, they didn't like this book when a lot of men start referencing this book personally. I just came across this last year, months ago. Chapter 5, or in Chapter 5, the unique disadvantage of dating while black, we explore the duality in which digital sexual racism manifests in themes of simulates hypervisibility and invisibility, where black women and men are simultaneously ignored and hyper racialized by non black daters. We document gender patterns of interracial partnership, including how women intimacy is politicized more rigorously than men in black communities. Hmm. On police more rigorously than men in black communities. How educated black women prefer same race, similar educating partners. Okay. While facing significant barriers when they attempt to carry out those preferences. Black women and men share disadvantage in the dating market, allowing us to lens through which to see the ways their romantic experience are deeply shaped by race and gender. In chapter 6, the Asian experience, resistance, and complicity, we discuss how the transformation of controlling image from yellow pure to model minorities has alienated Asian masculinity while embracing a sick portrait of Asian femininity. Similar to black men, Asian women are criticized for their relative high outmarriage rate. They're often frame outmarriage as resistance to Asian patriarchy, but such argument ignores white gender oppression and Asian fetishization. Hmm. Indeed, many of the Asian women we interview exhibit uncertain about the intentions of non-Asian daters, or what we call ambiguous fetishization. We find that the prevalence of intermarriage between Asian women and white men is not driven by white men pursuit pattern as a often claimed. and that both Asian men and women engage in anti-blackness in their dating preference, reflecting their place in the triracial hierarchy. Chapter 7. Hey, you're Latina. Do you like to dance? That's an interesting one. The privilege and disadvantage of Latino daters turn to the often contradictory position of Latino daters in a racialized and gender desirability hierarchy, as they have for Asian American cultural image, have historically perpetuate stereotypes pertaining to Latino and Latina race, gender, and sexuality. These images remain in circulation, at times inherit sexual interest while also limiting a diverse community. Power for self definition. We explore how the intersection of transnational color families are gendered hierarchy nesting within the traditional racial binary of the United States, such that the some Latinos, as we see incentively, viva for the better position in desirability hierarchy and the new digital sexual racism. Sometimes this leads to anti-blackness. Often it leads to the internalization of colorism. In Chapter 8, Post-Racial Multiracialism, a challenge to the white racial frame. We explore the experience and treatment of mixed race individuals on online dating. We find that multiracial white daters are afforded to relatively privileged status and desirability hierarchy. Apart from both white and other mon-racial or non-racial or monoracial daters, however, this affects the gender minority women, generally privileged whiteness, and white multiracial multiraciality over minority men, while minority men treat their monoracial minority and multiracial co-ethnic equal and display a disinterest of whiteness. The online nature of digital sexual racism amplify the sexual objectification and multiracial daters by others who attempt to visualize, dissect their bodies in ways to refine phenotype while holding a general and more exclusive view when it comes to dating. In theory, multiracial data still reproduce patterns of anti-blackness. In practice, taken together, our findings suggest that the Borginous U.S. multiracial population will not necessarily undermine the existence of racial hierarchy, which remains bitterest by gender anti-black bias. We conclude that black people, we conclude this book by exploring potential response to this new racialism or racism. We strongly believe that the providers of dating service and responsibility for mitigating digital sexual racism, though not only public messaging to their clientele, but also crucializing examining of the design of their service, they can intentionally frame their performance or platforms to communicate core values of respect, discourse, and racial and gender progressive philosophies. The emphasis of the search emphasized should not be excluded to reduce individual and categories, and in the process amplify the significant and racial categories. It does not have to be this way. But more important than what any company can do, we as U.S. Americans must reflect the engaging of the public conversation of intimacy and the race. Individuals bear the social obligation of thinking deeply about whether why we are a certain racial preference or seriously consider committing disruptions of many fields of natural inclination. After all, we all fight racial injustice in public life. We must also remember that every hopeful click of swipe, or no matter how trivial it seems, has last implications to the racial division in the United States. A note on the data and methods used in this book. This is very important. Listen good, and this is going to conclude this introduction part of the book. Unless otherwise stated, the statistic analysis presented in this book are based on the confidential data we obtained from a majority dating website in the United States. We have access to not only the profiles of more than 1 million users all over the country, but also how they interact with other users' various racial identities. Because these interactions took place privately, they provide a behind the scenes portrayal of how US Americans make their most personal decisions. Unlike swiping apps like Tinder, in which messages cannot be sent until both daters have indicated mutual interest, this dating platform places no control on who can send an initial response message and who can't respond. You get that? Good. And I probably will emphasize that. As much as these statistical analyses are useful in showing gender patterns, they reveal like about the meaning and motivation behind these decisions to understand how race intertwines with desirability, and we thus conduct several or 77 in-depth interviews with online daters from diverse racial backgrounds and sexual identities. These interviews provide tremendous insight into what we can not see in the dating site data. What people think and feel about race when they decide when whom to approach and whom to what. At least what people are willing to admit to researching that they think and feel. More often than not, we see that daters are aware and that race plays an important role in shaping their perception of complete strangers. Extensively arching research supplement our quantitative and qualitative analysis by giving us a window into the way race has always separated people in the United States. We present compelling evidence that gender racism is still deeply ingrained in our most intimate decisions. More details about our data source analysis approaches are discussed in the appendix of this book. And this book has 8 chapters. Appendix is at the end of this book. That concludes the introduction part of the Dating Divide. And how I gonna go about this book and how I feel. This will probably be a series, depending how much I'm gonna be dedicated going through this. It's slowly gonna determine my mood, but nonetheless, we're going through the introduction stage of this book, by God, and I'm glad, I'm happy. Let me put this here. So that concludes the introduction part of the Dating Divide. And like always, when we go back and recap, we're gonna go straight into the chapter ahead, and I might separate and break up in chunks, possibly. So let me do this. Let me do this. Waiting for my computer to load up. There we go. I'm going to look and see what's in the chat room right now. And I'm going to call this a day. Oh, good. No one's listening. Okay. I guess that's it. That's pretty much it. I went for 60 minutes. Oh, perfect. So I can end it here. So if no one has no questions, that's fair. I'd like to thank everybody for listening to today's broadcast. Looking forward to the next upcoming broadcast. We'll see. There's some days I might take some days off. Not saying I'm really back, but I got something for content, and I'm gonna use it to the full extent. It's like back in the days when I did the book series on a few books I've done. The Dating Divide will definitely be on the docket, and I'm gonna carry it out. Like always, guys, I appreciate y'all for listening. Looking forward for y'all to go in the comment section and give your take on this introduction part of the chapter. This is a part two of a lengthy introduction, but it's well worth it. We're going to hear from your thoughts in the comment section of this stream. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care and good night.